Welcome to our section on religious myths and languages. We'll talk about myths as well as religious language and their role in religion. When we look at religious ideology, there are a couple of very important components to consider. First is cosmology or worldview. The second are myths, and we'll delve more deeply into the meaning of both of these. The worldview, which is also known as cosmology, is very important because it explains the nature of reality for a particular culture. It outlines the rules that that particular culture follows based upon how they see themselves in context to everything else and everyone else around them. Also, origins talk about how they came to be and the role of the supernatural in those origins. And the worldview, again, of a culture is very important. For example, if we look at this constellation that some of you may be familiar with, we call it Orion the Hunter, and the whole ideology and mythology around Orion the Hunter. And when a person who has a background in knowing the story of Orion looks at the sky, and culture saw the bow and the quiver with the arrows in it and all of those things, and that's how it developed a name, Orion the Hunter, for people from the West. However, the same constellation, when being viewed from, for example, in the lower bottom of the slide, the same constellation viewed in Asian cultures, particularly Japanese cultures, sees a kimono, a woman's kimono, the sleeve of a kimono, represented by the same constellation. And then in the upper right corner of the slide, the African djembe drum. Again, based upon one's worldview, that is influencing how we view things and how we identify and talk about things. If we go further into the Navajo worldview, for example, the belief that all elements are bound together in a system where one affects one another. They see the world in terms of relationships and connections. That humans are just one cog in the natural world. And the idea is that humans have to behave properly according to the Navajo rules in order to prevent disaster, or which is known for them as to walk in beauty. And for them, the idea and the reason behind illness is disharmony. And in order to correct that illness, in Navajo worldview and Navajo religion, there will be rituals that will be done in order to reestablish this harmony, in order to rid individuals or even an entire group of the illness that may have visited them. From a traditional Judeo-Christian worldview, the world was created for the benefit of humankind. That the idea coming from the Hebrew scriptures in Genesis, that the world was created for humankind to manage it, to till the soil, to name the animals. We see naming the animals and all of that, but it's humankind that's at the center of the world. That therefore gives the right for humans to manipulate the natural world. And we still see arguments about that and issues, people taking sides about that even today with things like ecology and pollution, global warming and all of that, manipulating it. From a Western view about illness is that there's an empirical cause. So by discovering the cause and naming that cause, it can be fixed. I'm going to turn now to a couple of other things that have relevance that distinguish them from myths. The first would be folk tales. Folk tales are regarded as fiction. They're meant to entertain. In a folktale, there will be supernatural elements, but the folktale is still considered to be a secular story. And the characters in a folktale are both human and or non-human. And when does a folktale take place? It exists independent of time and space. And one of the clues that we have to knowing that it's a folk tale, because very often it will begin with once upon a time. There's no fixed time or identifiable time other than once upon a time, because it exists independent of time and place. Legends are actually based on real people, persons, and events. Legends have few, if any, supernatural elements to them. The characters in legends are generally human, and they occurred, the exploits and the feats of legends occurred either in the present or in the recent past in the modern world. This picture is of Casey Jones, and Casey Jones was an engineer who worked on the railroad, and he was worked the double shift to cover for a fellow engineer who was ill. He completed a run from Canton, Mississippi to Memphis, and he was faced with the task of returning aboard engine number 1 headed southbound. Sam Webb, a fireman for Illinois Central, accompanied Jones on the journey. The train was originally running more than an hour and a half behind, and Jones, who was always known for being on time, in fact, they said you could pretty much set your clock by his train whistle, knowing when he came through your town and he blew the whistle, it was a certain time. He was determined to arrive as scheduled. So he took the locomotive up to speeds nearing 100 miles per hour in an effort to make up the time. And as he made a turn into Vaughn, Mississippi, Webb warned him there was another train parked on the tracks ahead of them. As quickly as Jones could, he grabbed the brake with one hand and pulled the whistle with the other and attempted to warn all of those around the train. He told Webb to jump to safety and at the same time trying to slow the train. The collision was brutal, and all the passengers on the train survived with the exception of Casey Jones, who was struck in the throat while holding one hand on the brake and the other hand on the whistle. And out from Memphis at Jackson, Tennessee is the Casey Jones Museum and other things dedicated to his memory. But Casey Jones will be considered a legend. I want to move now into talking about what myths are not. Myths are not a falsehood. While the common idea of a myth is it being something that's falsehood, in the context of the anthropological study of religion, a myth is not a falsehood. And that's very important. A myth is not just simply a story of classical Greek or Roman gods. It's not just simply a story from long ago. It's not just a belief of tribal people living far away, nor is a myth a form of early and erroneous science that's now being replaced by quote unquote real science. Those are things that myths are not. So we talked about what myths are not, and now we come to the definition of myths. They're religions, sacred stories about supernatural beings and powers and their roles in creating the universe and living things. Mythology is a collection of those stories, and the term can be applied to all religions. All religions have their mythology. They have their myths. It's the sacred charter, if you will, of a society in that they validate religious beliefs and values for contemporary life. Let's look at how myths change over time. When they're written narratives, and all myths start out as oral tradition, but once they become written, as they are in many cultures, they develop a sense of stability. The language that myths use oftentimes can become uncommon language over time because of the passage of time, because language does indeed change. That's why you can think of, for example, if we look at the Bible and we know that the version that is most common for many people is the King James Version, but it contains language that's not commonly used these days. We don't speak in terms of thou and thee and thine, except when using that particular text. There are some societies that actually have a distinct dialect or language that's used in a religious context. Changes do occur in written text, but they are usually deliberate. Let's talk some more about myths. Myths in any religion are regarded as fact. They're accepted on faith. They're the source of authority on moral and ethical issues. They are sacred with supernatural elements, and myths contain the stories of both human and non-human characters. Myths happen in the remote past, in another world, or in earlier periods of today's world. The mythic storyline accounts for the orderliness and validates contemporary values of a society. This is the surface meaning of myths, but it goes deeper than that. The deeper meaning, deeper level of meaning of myths can be found in the mythic symbols that represent important element of supernatural realm, the order of nature, human role in creation, or the relationship between these. We see pictured here the sword and the stone, which comes from the story about King Arthur that many people are familiar with. This concludes part 1 of religious language and myths.